The early morning sun cut through the towering windows of the Washington, D.C. courthouse and danced across Sarah Bennett as she adjusted her navy blazer and straightened her leather briefcase. 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center had bestowed upon her a quiet confidence at 52. Sarah hadn't planned on being in traffic court that Monday morning. Her research in racial disparities of the justice system normally had her in libraries and behind computer screens, looking over data and patterns. But something about this recent surge in complaints of discriminatory traffic citations drew her from her comfortable office to these hard wooden benches. The courthouse was abuzz with its usual morning activity. Security guards nodded at those they knew. Clerks shuffled papers. Nervous defendants whispered to lawyers. Sarah watched it all keenly, her notebook on her lap, her pen moving quickly as subtle interactions sketched out how some people were greeted with smiles, while others she received curt nods, how some defendants were cut off, while others were permitted to speak. Wasn't any ordinary listener. Few people in the room realized it, but as one of Georgetown's most highly regarded professors, Sarah had shaped the minds of untold numbers of attorneys, judges presiding today in these selfsame courts. Included, her writings on judicial bias were assigned reading in law schools from coast to coast, and her expert testimony had turned the tide in more than one seminal case regarding racial discrimination. But today, however, she sat quietly at the back, dressed conservatively in her blazer and pencil skirt, indistinguishable from any other working professional who happened to be issued a traffic ticket. Her own citation allegedly for parking incorrectly on K Street was nestled in her briefcase. She could have simply paid the fine online, but something about the circumstances, the unclear signage, the officer's dismissive attitude motivated her to appeal it. The room slowly filled with more, young and old, professional and casual. Spanning the complete, Sarah could see the spectrum of Washington's population was inherently segregating people, forming invisible yet definite lines of division. Her trained eye caught the anxiety in subways manifested in defiance across some faces, resignation on others, and still others showing the confident ease of those that knew the system. Just at 9 a.m., the BFF's voice boomed with the command for all to rise. Sarah stood with the others straight yet relaxed. She smiled as Judge Michael Harrison entered, his black robes billowing behind him. His reputation preceded him. He was notoriously very hard on traffic infractions, and even more so when the defendants were minorities. What this young judge could not have prepared for was that among the ones he would be judging today sat the very professor who taught him constitutional law and wrote one of his recommendations for with the appointment to Judd Il. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she watched him take confident stride up to the bench. She remembered him as a bright-eyed student, always first to raise his hand, impassioned about justice, but sometimes blind to his preconceptions. As the proceedings began and case after case was called, Sarah continued her careful observations, documenting each interaction, each decision, each supple shift in tone. She knew that sometimes the most vivid lessons about justice came not from the pages of a textbook or from words spoken from a lectern, but from life itself. Forced them to confront their biases. Little did anyone in that courtroom know, but this ordinary Monday morning was about to turn into an extraordinary lesson in justice, humility, and the relentless challenge of unconscious bias in the American legal system. Judge Michael Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's docket. At 35, one of the youngest judges appointed to the D.C. Traffic Court, with practiced efficiency and pride in the strict order he kept in his courtroom. The morning sunlight cast sipping his black coffee over shadows across the polished mahogany of his desk. His clerk could arrange the day's cases in neat stacks. Parking violations, speeding tickets, and other infractions most of his colleagues would consider mundane. But Harrison sought each case as an opportunity to uphold the law, no matter how small the violation. His reputation for being particularly strict preceded him down the hallways of the courthouse. Defense attorneys warned their clients of his nonsensical manner, and even veteran lawyers straightened their ties a little tighter before entering his courtroom. Some whispered that he was trying to prove himself due to his youth, while others suggested he was building a record for higher judicial appointments. Today's docket looked typical: 27 cases, mostly traffic violations. Harrison scanned them, making mental notes. His eyes lingered for a second on a parking citation issued on K Street, noting the defense named Sarah Bennett. There was something about the name that teased at his memory, but he let it go. After handling several thousand cases, names often vaguely familiar seem, he donned his black robes. Harrison thought about his law school days at Georgetown, how those halls had shaped him, molded his perception of justice and the law. He remembered heated debates over constitutional rights, over what was fair and equal. Yet, in the traffic court, he had made his own sense of justice swift, unyielding, and inflexible. A knock from the bailiff on the door indicated that it was time to start. Harrison gestured toward his papers, squared his shoulders, and took a deep breath. He cast a glance in the mirror and studied his reflection, young face set in serious lines, dark hair neatly combed, robes perfectly arranged, the image of judicial authority he had worked so hard to cultivate. Through the private corridor to his courtroom, Harrison went over the litany of personal rules. Keep it under control, don't play favorites, uphold the letter of the law no matter what. These had served him well in his first year on the bench, earning him respect if not popularity. His mind briefly wandered to his old constitutional law professor, whose lessons about justice and equality had once seemed so clear. Now, in the daily grind of traffic court, justice seemed simpler: black and white, guilty or not guilty, pay the fine or face the consequences. The bias stood ready at the door of the courtroom. Harrison could hear the familiar shuffle of people rising on the other side. In moments, he would assume his position of authority, ready to dispense justice as he saw fit, unconscious that this ordinary Monday would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. All rise. The bay's voice boomed, and Judge Harrison entered his domain, his face stern, confident, and totally oblivious that among those faces now turned toward him was one which would, in due course, remind him of lessons he had invoked, now forgotten on his journey to the bench. Morning went along like most in Judge Harrison's court, efficiently until case number 47 was called. The clerk yelled out, "Sarah Bennett, parking violation on K Street," her voice carrying across the busy courtroom. Sarah elegantly rose from her seat, deliberate, dignified, and headed to the podium. Several attorneys present noticed something different about her demeanor. She carried herself not with the typical nervousness of a defendant, but with the confident bearing of someone intimately familiar with courtroom proceedings. Judge Harrison barely glanced up from his papers, his voice carrying the same stern tone he used all morning. "Miss Bennett, you're charged with parking in a restricted zone during rush hour. How do you play it?" Sarah's voice was clear and measured as she responded, "Not guilty, Your Honor." She began to explain about obstructed signage and confusing rules about parking, but Harrison cut her off mid-sentence. Something had been doing a lot that morning to defendants. "Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his tone rising, decidedly impatient, "the officer's report clearly indicates you were parked in a clearly marked restricted zone between 4 o'clock and 6 p.m. Are you suggesting the officer was incorrect?" Several observers in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at his tone. A few regular attorneys exchanged glances, noting how the judge's interruption seemed particularly abrupt. This time Sarah, however, remained unruffled. "Your Honor, if I may," she continued with practiced calm, "I have photographs showing that the sign in question was partially covered by overgrown branches, making it impossible to read the restriction times from the angle of approach." Judge Harrison's expression hardened, had heard every excuse in the book, and the latter was no exception. "Miss Bennett, the time of this court is precious. The report of the officer shows no such blockage." As Sarah leaned over to get the photographs from her briefcase, Harrison waved his hand dismissively. that won't be necessary. The onus of knowing and obeying parking laws rests with the driver, not the city. The exchange continued with Sarah retaining her poised manner and Judge Harrison becoming progressively sterner, his answers getting shorter, his voice more concise to the regular courthouse. To them, it had been no more than another case of the young judge exerting his authority. What made this interchange particularly remarkable was the unusual equanimity of Sarah in the face of the judge's growing exasperation. She stood tall and kept eye contact, answering each dismissal with the practiced patience of a person who had spent years teaching others about the very principles of justice being demonstrated in this moment. The tension in the courtroom mounted as the exchange proceeded. Even the bias shifted in uncomfortably at his post. The other defendants waiting their turn watched with growing interest, sensing that something about this case was different from the routine traffic violations they witnessed all morning. Little did Judge Harrison know that his next decision would transform this seemingly routine traffic case into a moment that would challenge his entire approach to justice. Judge Harrison was leaning forward in his chair, already having made up his mind before Sarah could conclude her final statement. The fluorescent lights cast unyielding shadows across his grim features as he gave his sentence. Miss Bennett, this court finds you guilty of contravening City Parking Code 23. For he declared, his voice containing the echo of finality, given your seeming disregard for clearly posted regulations and your efforts to dispute the officer's professional judgment in setting the fine at $500, well above the usual $100 penalty. A murmur of incredulity swept the courtroom. Even the hardy court officers turned to each other in surprise. This was a highly unusual fine for a minor parking ticket. A number of the attorneys present shifted nervously in their seats, acknowledging that this was an incredibly disproportionate sentence. Sarah stood stock still at the podium, her face expressionless, her gaze fixed on Judge Harrison as he wrote out the amount of the fine on her citation. The strokes of his pen were sharp and definitive. The young judge looked every inch like a man very pleased with himself, convinced he was sending a crystal clear message about respect for the rule of law. Harrison continued, his voice growing louder to become more stern. I want it noted for the court record that this court holds in very low disbelief of citizens who try to get out of their duty by challenging the competency of our law enforcement officers. The court clerk furiously typed, recording every word. The frequent attorneys who attended cases in this courtroom had never witnessed such a steep fine for a parking violation. Some started taking notes, feeling this may become relevant in future cases. Sarah spoke finally, her voice low and even despite the circumstance. Your Honor, I accept the court's decision. She paused, adjusting her glasses deliberately. However, I should point out that this will unfortunately require me to cut my constitutional law lecture short this afternoon. Judge Harrison barely lifted his gaze from the papers in front of him as he continued to write his final notes on the case. Miss Bennett, your scheduling conflicts are of no consequence to this court. You would have been best served to remember your professional obligations before taking to breaking city parking ordinances. The courtroom was uncommonly still. Even the bailiffs who had seen enough cases in this court, it would seem, had sensed something big was about to. The morning sun had reached its peak outside, casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor and illuminating the dust particles that danced in the air. Sarah gathered her things together, taking her sweet time over it. Every move was slow, calculated, and tranquil. There was no trace of anger or frustration, the usual accompaniment to a sentence as hard as this. Instead, something was in the air, a quieted confidence arising from her that spoke volumes of this case being far from over. Another case was being called right then and there, yet eyes were still fixed on Sarah. She walked slowly back to her seat, and Judge Harrison, now oblivious to the fact that his next epiphany would shake the very foundation of his judicial confidence, had already moved on. Sarah's modulated voice filled the courtroom as she tagged on a final comment. I really must get home to grade papers for tomorrow's advanced seminar at Georgetown Law. You recall those deadlines well, Judge Harrison, from when you sat in my constitutional law class 10 years ago." The courtroom hushed. Judge Harrison's subaturing hand froze in midair, the blood draining from his face. The revelation was almost a palpable force as recollections came flooding back. Professor Bennett standing at the front of the lecture hall challenging students to make deep considerations about justice, fairness, and unconscious bias. Several attorneys in the gallery audibly gasped. The court clerk's fingers hovered motionless above her keyboard. Even the bailiff, always so stoic, struggled to maintain his professional composure. Judge Harrison looked up slowly for the first time that morning and really saw Sarah Bennett. Standing before him was exactly as he remembered her from his law school days. The same commanding presence, the same inquiring gaze that steered him through complicated constitutional principles. It was ironic to the point of devastation. Professor Bennett, who had written one of his strongest recommendations for judicial appointment, who had praised his understanding of equal justice under the law, had last night experienced how far he had strayed from those principles. Memories came flooding back, impassioned lectures about judicial temperament, warnings about subtle ways bias could seep into decisions, an insistence that each case be treated the same without regard to a defendant's background. The young judge's face turned beet red with embarrassment. Any earlier SMUD now evaporated by the realization he had just provided a perfect case study in just the kind of biased judgment she had taught him to guard against. Sarah remained standing, triumphant nor accusatory, still the teacher, and this became an unexpected lesson not just to her former student, but for everybody in the courtroom. The silence was to last an eternity. For those who regularly observed the court, this was the longest pause ever experienced in traffic court. The morning sun continued its traverse across the courtroom floor, illuminating the drama now unfolding as if on a stage, with a spotlight on an extraordinary drama. Judge Harrison looked first down at the excessive fine he had just imposed, then up again at his former professor. In that instant, he was no longer the confident young judge, but once again the law student who had sat so avidly in her classroom learning about just such principles which he had just now failed to uphold. The courtroom of Judge Harrison remained as silent and still, as if the weight of recognition weighed upon his shoulders, staring at Professor Bennett. What a coincidence! His early mentor regarding the meaning of justice. 10 minutes recess, he called out abruptly, his voice cracking slightly. Across the silent room came the bang of the gavel. Without looking at anyone, he turned swiftly to retire to his chambers, his black robes billowing behind him. Once inside, Harrison collapsed into his leather chair, loosening his collar. His hand still shook as he pulled out an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, proudly standing with the constitutional law faculty. Memories flooded back. Her passionate lectures about equal justice, her patient guidance during office hours, and most painfully her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career. The very letter sat framed on his wall, its words now seeming to mock him. In his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings in his mind. He had cut her off sooner than other defendants. He had refused her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the standard amount, and he had done it all without once properly looking at her face. The buyer tapped gently on the door to indicate the recess was all but over. Harrison stood before his mirror, seeing himself through new eyes. The young judge, who had prided himself on being firm but fair, now appeared for precisely what he was, a man who had lost sight of the basic principles his professor had labored with such dedication to instill. The courtroom hummed with hushed discussions outside his chambers. Attorneys who regularly appeared before him exchanged knowing looks. Wondering how this revelation would change the young judge they knew, Sarah sat back down in her chair and began grading papers, as if it was just another day in her decade-plus career teaching justice. Her serene manner made the incident touching for the future lawyers present. She had not come to argue, but instead had let the moment be a teachable one. Harrison took a few deep breaths, smoothed his robes, and steeled himself to re-enter the courtroom. He knew that the next few minutes would define not only this case, but possibly his judicial career. Judge Harrison re-entered his courtroom, his bearing distinctly altered. Where the confident stride had been, was now a much more deliberate walk. Thoughtful, rather than stern, Professor Bennett began, my voice carrying a humility that surprised the regular court attendees. I owe you, and this court, an apology. My conduct this morning failed to meet the very standards of justice you taught me a decade ago. He inhaled deeply, as he often did when preparing to continue. I have allowed my position to blind me from my own biases. Today, you have given all of us a very powerful reminder of the importance of fair and equal treatment under the law. The courtroom remained silent as Harrison picked up Professor Bennett's citation. I find vacating the $500 fine further. I hereby dismiss this case in its entirety based upon that ambiguous signage to which you drew the court's attention. Sarah nodded graciously, but Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Professor Bennett, your lessons about constitutional rights and equal justice weren't mere classroom theory, they were principles I swore to uphold. Today I failed to live up to those principles. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Let this be a reminder to everyone present, myself especially, that justice must be blind to prejudice rather than not to reason. Our duty is to hear each case with fresh ears and see each person before us with clear eyes. The regular attorneys exchanged impressed glances. This was unprecedented, a judge acknowledging his bias in open court, and then changing his ruling. Some began scribbling notes, realizing they were witnessing one of the more remarkable moments in the history of the court. Sarah spoke last, her voice still carrying the pedagogical cadences of the 100 or more lectures she had delivered. Thank you, Judge Harrison. This is what our legal system is based, not just on rules, but on the humility and wisdom of those who interpret them. The shift in the courtroom was palpable. What it had begun as a blasé session of traffic court had evolved into a powerful teaching about justice, about humility, and about the ongoing challenge of unconscious bias. The other defendants present and the attorneys who were in the courtroom that day testified that Harrison subsequently conducted the remainder of that day's hearing in a noticeably different manner, more patient, attentive, and even-handed. 3 months later from the incident in the courtroom, Georgetown Law, the main auditorium was completely filled. Presiding Judge Michael Harrison was at the podium along with Professor Sarah Bennett, addressing an engrossed audience of law students and faculty as to what took place that day in traffic court. Harrison lightened wasn't about a parking ticket. It was about realizing just how easily our prejudices can cloud our judgment, even when we think we're being fair. The case had become such a potent teaching tool at Georgetown Law that Professor Bennett had integrated it into her curriculum, using it to demonstrate how unconscious bias could reveal itself even in low-level legal disputes. The story had spread beyond Georgetown, ran in legal publications and judges' continuing education courses nationwide. Judge Harrison's courtroom had become different. Typical lawyers observed the dramatic change in his demeanor. Every case was scrutinized with due diligence. Without regard to defendants' physical appearance or ethnicity, his notoriety as toughest judge gradually gave way to being thought of as one of the more open-minded jurists on the bench. Professor Bennett had turned the incident into a seminal research paper entitled Justice in the Mirror, Examining Judicial Bias in Minor Courts. Already, the paper was informing judicial education programs nationally. Sometimes, Professor Bennett told an audience, the most critical teachable moments about justice come from the most uncomfortable moments. What is important isn't that we screw up, but how we act when our biases are exposed. The incident sparked a larger discussion inside the DC court system. Other judges began reviewing their own decision-making patterns led to new guidelines concerning the disposition of traffic court cases. Statistical analysis indicated a dramatic reduction in disparate sentencing within demographic groups. At the end of this lecture, one student asked Judge Harrison what he had learned most from the experience. He smiled reflectively before answering, "Justice isn't about knowing the law, but it's about staying humble to realize our own prejudices and being brave enough to correct them." The case had become known as the professor's lesson, a reminder among law students that true justice requires constant self-examination and the courage to admit when we've fallen short of our ideals. The courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison stared at Professor Bennett, his former mentor who had shaped his early understanding of justice. His hands gripped the wooden bench, knuckles turning white. 10 minutes recess, he announced abruptly. The gad's sharp crack resounded around the silent chamber. Not meeting anyone's eyes, he quickly retreated into his chambers, black robes billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside, Harrison slumped into his leather chair, his hands shaking as he pulled an old Georgetown Law yearbook from his bottom drawer. There she was, Professor Sarah Bennett, photographed during his graduating year, her kind but challenging eyes staring back at him through time. It all came back now, as if from a burst dam, her impassioned lectures on equal justice under the law, her patient guidance during office hours, as he struggled to master complex constitutional theory, and most painfully of all, her glowing letter of recommendation that had helped launch his judicial career, the very letter set, framed on his wall, its words now appearing to mock his recent actions. Alone in his chambers, Harrison replayed the morning's proceedings with growing horror. He had interrupted her sooner than other defendants. He had dismissed her evidence without consideration. He had imposed a fine 5 times the normal fine. And he had done all of that without once properly looking at her face. The shame burned in his chest as he recalled her lessons on judicial temperament and unconscious bias. How many times had she warned their class about the subway's prejudice could creep into one's decision-making? And now he had become a perfect case study in all those things she had taught them to guard against. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, whispers raced through the gallery. Attorneys who regularly appeared before Harrison exchanged knowing looks. Court officers tried to maintain their professional composure, but even they couldn't help glancing at Professor Bennett with newfound respect. Sarah remained unruffled, grading papers, as if this was just another teachable moment in her decades-long career. The calmness in her demeanor made the moment all the more touching. She hadn't come for an argument, but instead allowed the moment to be a strong lesson regarding justice and pride. They knocked on Harrison's chamber door to let him know that recess was all but over. The young judge stood before his mirror, looking at himself through new eyes. The stern disciplinarian, who had prided himself on being firm but fair, now appeared as precisely what he had become, a man who had lost sight of the fundamental principles his professor had fought so hard to instill as he prepared to return to the courtroom. Harrison knew the next few minutes would define not only this case, but perhaps his whole judicial career. The weight of the moment rested upon him as he squared his robes, garnering his courage to confront the reality about himself and his actions. He thought about what Professor Bennett would ask from him at this very moment, not excuses, not defensiveness, but honest self-reflection and the willingness to correct course. Those lessons she had taught so many years ago were about to be put to their greatest test, but not in a classroom discussion. The real-world application was the true test. The next knock on his chamber door was more insistent. Recess was over, and it was time to make the decisions. He took one final deep breath, squared his shoulders, and prepared to show whether he could live up to the principles instilled in him by Professor Bennett all those years ago.